welcome to Introduction to Jewish Mysticism. This is class 1 of 10. And before we get into going over the trajectory of the material for today, I would like to start with a story. Stories which are, in fact, tried, tested, and true methods of communicating information on multiple levels about what it means to be a Jewish mystic. This story takes place in the Ukraine in the early 1700s, where there was a teacher known as the Baal Shem Tov, a name in Hebrew which translates to master of the good name. This was an individual who originally came seemingly out of nowhere from the Carpathian Mountains and appeared in the midst of the Ukrainian Jewish community at the time. And there are many, many miraculous stories told about him. He is attributed with founding the Hasidic movement, which is a mystical movement that started in the 1700s and exists until today. And they say the stories about the Baal Shem Tov are so miraculous that if you believe none of them, you're a heretic, but if you believe all of them, you're a fool. So with that premise in mind, the story goes that among the Baal Shem Tov's amazing abilities was he could use healing, herbal healing, amulet healing, that if somebody had recently died, he could go to their gravesite and he could actually wake them up. That if they had just died, or even if they hadn't been buried on their bed, he could go and they would call him, or he would feel called by some angelic voice and he would arrive and they would miraculously wake up again. People were obviously astounded by this ability and they asked him, Baal Shem Tov, how are you able to do this? And he says, well, you know, it's actually very easy to wake the dead because they are so badly wanting to be alive. What's really difficult is to wake the living because they're convinced they are already alive. And in many ways, this story captures the essence of a lot of what it means to be a mystic and to practice mysticism. It's to be alive, to be truly alive. What does it mean to be alive or awake? Who could we think of that we say, oh, they're really alive? Often people think of children, just joyfully exploring the world and playing. There's a sense of serenity, just being who they are and expressing themselves. There's the ability just to have fun and be full of joy and to laugh. You could say that's to be really alive. Some people think about contemplation and the ability to gain clarity of our own inner dimensions, to understand the parts of ourselves that might not always be so apparent, and in the process, come into contact with the outside world in a way we might normally not had access to. These are different ways that people consider waking up or being alive. And also, there's a certain sense of responsibility or service to the world that comes through a path of mysticism. This picture here, you can see in the middle, that's Martin Luther King. And second from the right is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who, as a Jewish mystic who was alive in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the United States, felt compelled and obligated, and that his spiritual life reached fulfillment when he marched. He said he was praying with his feet, and he took inspiration from previous eras of Jewish mysticism to do that, knowing that in many ways in Jewish mysticism, aliveness includes also how we encounter the world, how we act in the world, how we are moral, ethical, how we help others to be liberated and actualized. So this is class 1. We're going to be looking at What is mysticism, broadly speaking, in the most universal sense? What does it mean to be a mystic? Not even forgetting the Jewish fold itself for a moment, but saying, how could someone understand this concept in the broadest and maybe definite sense to be defined? We're also going to be looking at what is Jewish mysticism particularly, and how does that distinguish itself, or how can we distinguish it from mysticism more broadly? And lastly, we're going to be looking at what are the different types of Jewish mysticism, because there are many epochs and flows and changes that Jewish mysticism, like any religion, may I say any tradition, any lineage goes through. So you can more or less group them into categories without complicating things too much. And we're going to be taking a brief history of everything that is Jewish mysticism in the second half of this class. So to begin with the first question, what is mysticism? What is this often associated with joy-evoking, blissful, unitive, and as you see here, this boy has a book. There's often mysticism is communicated using the languages of religion and mythology. What does it mean? There's a fairly common conception. One type of mystic is sort of like the joyful one, the laughing one, the one who is just filled with the awe of all there is. And it tends to be coupled with a knowledge of religious texts that are used for reflecting on and communicating. There are many other types. And in fact, mysticism in common parlance these days is often overlapped with magic and even like the occult and those kinds of things. Mysticism in this course has a fairly specific definition, though I'm, of course, open to anyone else's views of what it could be. The one definition that I tend to use is from an academic named Ninian Smart, who was a very important figure in modern religious studies. And in defining mysticism, he said it had two major components. One is an interior or introverted quest. So let's look at that. Interior, meaning inside of ourselves. Introverted, as opposed to extroverted, I suppose. And this idea of a quest in that it's a journey. It's not something that happens all at once. It is, for certainly most people, it is something that takes striving and effort and time. It's an interior or introverted quest that has this culmination in indescribable, otherwise known as ineffable experiences that cannot be ordinarily communicated through language. It's as though everyone around you is seeing in black and white, and all of a sudden you caught a glimpse of the color blue. How many people are going to be able to understand what the color blue is if they've never seen it? My answer is none. There are no people who could possibly really, really understand that. But imagine if you saw a color that nobody else has seen before, and you could somehow create a context in which other people could learn to see that color. Once they could see blue, you could verify it with each other. You could then maybe see red together. This is experiences that are indescribable, partially because other people have not experienced them. And in certain cases, it's because they come from a place that is truly beyond words, beyond physicality, beyond thought. And we'll be getting to some of those kinds of discussions and adventures farther along the course. But for now, it's just good to look at this definition. It's interior, introverted, it's inside of a person. There's a quest, and it culminates, meaning it peaks at the goal is this experience that the mystic will have that is beyond words. A common experience that in our culture, and I mean sort of Western secular culture, if you will, that is still accepted by the vast majority of people, even if they might not believe in mysticism, in, let's say, expanded states of consciousness, in God, or any of those things, a state of being that fits an ineffable experience, at least, that is very accepted, is falling in love. That many people have had a moment where they meet someone, or even let's say they give birth to a child, and there's something, or even you have a friend or something, there's something so incredibly evocative about that experience that there's all of these songs sung about it. And there are people who say, oh, you've never fallen in love. Well, let me tell you about it. And someone might, oh, I don't quite understand that. Maybe one day I'll get it. There's something that shines through in a way that is extraordinary. There are limitless, seemingly, types of experience described in mystical literature or hinted at, but falling in love is a pretty decent one. And another one, which has a little bit more controversy to it, but it has a lot in common, are things like the uses of psychedelics, hallucinogens, that one could argue, and I think fairly effectively, if it's held, especially in a intentional space, can evoke altered states of consciousness which have the same qualities of these ineffable moments and the interior quest, but a different route to get there, as opposed to meditation or fasting or those kinds of things. It can be through ingesting of a medicine. So much for mysticism broadly. These are the understandings that I want to present today. And what is Jewish mysticism vis-a-vis that definition? Here we see a picture of, this is a drawing of a Jewish mystic from the Middle Ages holding what's called in Kabbalah the tree of life. Some people see the tree of life as a pathway, right? That idea of the quest. And if you looked at the bottom, that says Malchut. In Hebrew, look at the top, it says Keter. Some people think that as they journey through this ladder, they go from something much more describable to the top of it is much more difficult to describe. There's actually a spectrum of ineffability that people are going through. And so we can look at this definition. So the first part of Nini and Smart's definition, introverted. I don't want to make massive generalizations without giving a bit of a preamble to say that religions are so incredibly vast. Like any culture, any religion, any tradition, including secular culture, in fact, these days, there are so many elements, it's actually impossible to define something really briefly, really accurately. And so I'm going to say something about Jewish mysticism that is not true 100% of the time, but is fairly accurate, especially vis-a-vis this definition, this description of introverted. It's that Judaism, in so many ways, including in the mysticism, is a group activity. It is done together. It is done in large numbers and small numbers, in pairs, in groups of 10, in groups of 100 and 1,000. But there are many recorded mystical paths and mystical moments, experiences within the Jewish mystical lineage that they happen not just to a person who's part of a group, but they happen to the people simultaneously. And there's people relating to common experiences in a group in writings. And also today, there are groups that are cultivating this kind of journey in which people have an opportunity actually to reflect on a shared experience in groups together. So this is not introverted. There are certainly introverted moments and experiences that are described in the history that people have today. It's not exclusively extroverted, let's say, but if I were to redefine based on this piece that I'm sharing, I wouldn't use the word introverted quest. I would say a quest for the sacred, because the sacred, so to speak, can happen externally and internally. It's not limited only to inside of ourselves. There's something that can be shared as a group moment. That's one of the characteristics, broadly speaking, of Jewish mysticism. And secondly, this notion of culminating in ineffable experiences. Similar to that example I gave a few minutes ago about Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the culmination of the Jewish mystical path in so many ways, in its actualized form, is in action. It is seen that the ineffable moment is a piece of the puzzle, a part of the cycle, a part of the journey. But if someone's at the top of the mystical mountain and they're not reaching down to help others, either other mystics to help attain like their mystical goals on their quest, or coming down the mountain, so to speak, to help people who are in need, who might have no idea what this mystical quest could be in the first place, but they just need assistance. If a mystic is not doing that in Judaism, they're often not seen as living their best selves, as leading their best lives, as being as holy or as righteous as they could be. That Jewish mysticism, broadly speaking, culminates in the lived experience and the lived help and service for those who have not yet had or have not had access to these same ineffable moments. What are the different types of Jewish mysticism? This is what I'm going to show you in a second, is a timeline that it could just be a spectrum. It could just be a rainbow with varying gradations in between. And in so many ways, these movements never ended. Even if officially they did, or we no longer do that, they find themselves repeating in different ways and playing out similar themes in new ways over the ages. It's like the integral theory idea of transcending and including, that a movement can arise, a new movement, and it doesn't erase the past movement. It includes it within it, but it grows beyond it. It transcends and includes it. And that can be said about a large amount of this material over the ages. So here it is, as they say in Hebrew, begadol, in a big picture. And I'm going to be going step by step through it one at a time. We have biblical prophecy. And you see that arrow pointing to the left. That is there because we don't actually know what came before that. Undoubtedly, there was mysticism that existed in the culture. And I say undoubtedly because mysticism seems to exist in one form or another in a great number of cultures. And knowing where the Bible picks up with the prophetic lineage, I have I guess I could say a great certainty that there was a type of mysticism that existed, whether it was prophetic or whether it was something else. The Bible is continuing a narrative that wasn't written down. So you have biblical prophecy. Merkavah is early rabbinic. It's about 2,000 years ago it begins, and it is talked about largely in the Talmud, which is a large collection of rabbinic sayings, and in some very sparse materials that have been collected that are from archives and things like that. Kabbalah surfaces in the Middle Ages. Lurianic Kabbalah comes after that, and it's here on its own because it had such a drastic and radical rereading of Kabbalah that it's noteworthy on its own. Later, much more recently, Hasidism developed first in Eastern Europe, and now in many places, including North America, including Israel. And we are going to end with us and right now and see how this lineage has progressed and how it may progress going forward. So let's look initially at biblical prophecy, which mythically ends around the time of the destruction of the first temple, about 6th century BCE. So we're talking 2,500, 2,600 years ago. Though if you look at, let's say, different shamanic orientations in different cultures, the idea of hearing the voice of a god, right? Even the Dalai Lama, not that that would be characterized necessarily as shamanic, but he has an official state medium who channels insights from a particular Tibetan deity and gives advice to the Dalai Lama. I mean, that sounds an awful lot like the biblical prophetic tradition, which was hearing the voice of God and having some kind of action or message or warning, or sometimes instilling punishment and sometimes saving people. An archetypal prophet is Moses, who parted the Sea of Reeds using the inspiration and the power of God, who was hearing some kind of subtle voice that other people couldn't hear. And it was leading him to action. And some prophets are chosen, it seems, out of the blue, and they're surprised by it. The prophet Jonah didn't want to be a prophet. Moses stumbles upon a burning bush. Who knows if they had training? But there's some prophets like Elijah and Elisha later on who certainly had a discipleship, almost like the Jedi. They were sort of, one would take on a student who would pass it on to the next generation. And some of them were mystic warriors, which is an interesting, I often think about mystics as peaceful, loving, really connective. But Devorah, the prophetess from the book of Judges, was a mystic leader, warrior, prophet. And these are categories that don't always line up in our contemporary world. This category on some level is the most controversial category to include in the history of Jewish mysticism, because not everyone thinks that prophecy is a type of mysticism. If we look at sort of the definitions we're using, is there's some kind of quest, there's some kind of ineffable experience, and I guess in the Jewish sense, there's some kind of action that follows. I think it fits fairly well. And someone could argue, like some people do, they have a definition of mysticism that really has to do with union with the divine. It really has to do with that kind of connection, the absolution of self. And you don't get a lot of those kinds of descriptions within biblical prophecy. And as I was just saying, it wasn't always a quest, that sometimes the quest chose them and they didn't always have a choice if they wanted to go or not and fulfill God's word. But regardless of how we're defining this, certainly Jewish mystics in history have defined this in many cases as Jewish mysticism, that they get inspired by prophetic writings, by prophets. Some mystics say that they actually have prophets who come to them as spirit guides and guide them and teach them. So I'm including it here as part of that broader definition of what it means to be a Jewish mystic. The next phase being Merkavah, which is a practice that today could be described as some form of astral travel, meaning the writings that the remnants that are remaining articulate this experience of people who are described as particular famous rabbis, but may not have been those actual rabbis. They may have been writing their experiences in the names of those rabbis, who either leave their bodies or actually go into another dimension with their bodies and start traveling through different chambers. And these are chambers that are guarded by different angels, different levels of angels. And often what they're trying to do is get from one chamber to the next. Sometimes there's even descriptions of them capturing angels and demanding secrets from them. But the trajectory is towards the highest level, the highest angel, known as Metatron. And Metatron gives them secret knowledge, secret wisdom. Sometimes these mystics also go and they try to glimpse the divine throne. And these were heavily, heavily guarded secrets as far as how people were able to access this. There were tremendous warnings given. They say that you couldn't tell the secrets of the Merkavah. Merkavah meaning chariot. So this is sort of a metaphor for this chamber they were journeying through. It's also called Hechalot mysticism. It's, again, these sort of stations that they go through, these chambers that they're traversing to. It's said that they couldn't teach this to anybody. You could, if there was a student who got it, you could kind of show them the sources where they could relate to, but you weren't actually supposed to teach it to anyone. And I don't know how strict that actually was, but there was a great prohibition on telling too much. One of the reasons likely was because of the power that was written on some level in this lineage. They write about it, that there is a risk of people getting damaged in these worlds, whether physically or psychologically or spiritually. And it actually took a fairly high level, so to speak, or a fairly developed individual to be able to do this kind of out-of-body travel into other dimensions and to come back well and whole. So that's Merkavah. And I want to state that as I describe these, I'm not sort of positing, I'm not requiring certainly any particular belief system around this. This is material to be reflected on. The Jewish mindset, I think in its best form, is it's a reflection tool. What is evoked for you when you hear this? Is there skepticism? That's a very valid reaction. Is there longing? Is there elation? Is there curiosity? This is an opportunity to reflect, and I don't ever require any particular kinds of buy-in to particular theologies or structures or experiences. It's a presentation and an opportunity to explore, reflect, and learn something along the way. So after Hechalot, after Merkavah mysticism, we get to Kabbalah in the 13th century. And a disclaimer here as well, Kabbalah is a term that's commonly used in common parlance for all of Jewish mysticism. People say Kabbalah goes back to Moses, that kind of thing. That Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism can be used interchangeably. In a more sort of formal academic sense, Kabbalah means this particular movement, which first was written down in the 13th century. So we're talking, I guess, about 800 years ago, but may have pre-existed its writing and likely did, but how far back it goes, nobody can actually say. Kabbalah, in very brief, it's a great love of mine to study and teach Kabbalah. So in very brief, and we'll explore this more later on, it is a journey in which the gradations of reality can be traversed one stage at a time. When Kabbalah came into existence, there was a very strong, let's say, pure monotheism that had been articulated by a philosopher named the Rambam, Maimonides, shortly before Kabbalah surfaces. And his attitude, basically, in his theology, was that we can't say anything about God. God is totally unknowable, totally unrelated to us, really. We can have metaphors to God, we can do this, but we can't say anything about God. We can say what God is not, but we can't say what God is. And that left some kind of gap between our world and God's world. And there was a whole mythical universe that preceded Maimonides, which on some level was kind of being brushed away. So Kabbalah comes very shortly after that. And it says, oh, sure, that God Maimonides talked about, that's called the infinite. We can't say anything about the infinite. The infinite is beyond our grasp, but what we can say something about are all these layers between our world and the infinite. And those layers have all of these associations in the Bible, and all of the mythology relates to those layers. The infinite one truly is unknowable, but we can know and we can experience this onion-like structure of our universe, sometimes articulated as a ladder or as the tree of life, as the Sephirot. This started as a smaller movement and eventually got really big, especially around the time of Isaac Luria, a single teacher. And what he taught, amazingly, this is not a mythological life I'm going to tell you about in a moment. This is historical fact as far as we know. He only taught for 2 years. This one man by the name of Isaac Luria, known as the Ari, the guy who ended up founding, I guess you could say, Lurianic Kabbalah, because when he was 38 years old, he died. And after teaching for 2 years, his students had recorded his teachings and started writing them down and passing them on. And that became a whole new wave. And again, to summarize it very succinctly, for the sake of this first class, Lurianic Kabbalah was about a sacred relationship between people who have bodies and can do actions, and the mystical realm, these layers of reality which are said to be out of order, they're broken, they're misaligned, that the cosmic realm itself needs human beings to repair. That's actually where the term tikkun olam is used most prominently before the modern era. It has to do with repairing the world, fixing the world. That's what the term means. But for the Lurianic Kabbalists, it meant actually meditating in very specific ways while they did ritual actions, so that their contemplation paired with their actions or their ethical actions, or there's even stories and teachings about laying down on the graves of holy people and using these meditations to have a unitive experience with their particular soul so that they can be transformed and rectified. And it all had to do with this cosmology, that the world was broken and there was an accident perhaps, or something went out of whack while the universe was being formed. And now the Kabbalists have an opportunity to actually repair it through their actions paired with their really like complex visualizations. And this is not an intro sort of Lurianic Kabbalah is not an introductory class on meditation. It is a lifestyle. It is something that it takes a tremendous amount of learning and practice and effort and capacity in the mind to hold many different elements while doing actions. And that led to a whole lot of happenings in the world, including these movements that were spawned from it that ended up leading people in quite negative directions ethically. And that was in the next 100 years or so. After this happened in the 16th century, people got into some trouble because they said, oh, we've liberated all the sparks that were hidden in the universe through our actions. And now what we need to be doing is we need to go into the realm of evil and liberate those sparks so we can return those to the cosmic realm and fix things there. And as you might imagine, things got out of hand. And so prohibitions around studying Kabbalah before the age of 40 are, I don't know if they arose, but they certainly rose and attained prominence during this time in the aftermath of those communities that were going down those difficult and tumultuous, but also negative routes in many cases. So you'll notice I just said that Isaac Luria himself died before he was 40. There are many very influential Kabbalists in history that learned Kabbalah in their teens. It was a prohibition of 40 that arose and was never universal, but there are many people to this very day who think that one should not study Kabbalah unless they're 40. And in the whole totality of Jewish mystical history, that's not the case. But as we've seen with Merkavah mysticism, there's a certain caution that is advisable when learning, and for teachers to be aware that this is very powerful material, and especially the practices paired with some of the concepts. It's good to take things slowly, to check in, to ask for help and guidance if there's a need. But regardless of some of the negative aftermath of this particular movement, it had a great deal of influence. It's still being studied till today. And some of the people that knew Lurianic Kabbalah and also took things in a, again, quite different direction were the Hasidim. Hasidism, which today people know about Hasidic Jews often by they have particular dress, long side curls for the men, often head coverings or wigs for women. There's hundreds of different denominations of Hasidic Judaism, the biggest of which today is Chabad the denomination, and there's also the Breslov, which is a sort of decentralized Hasidic movement. There's hundreds of thousands of people in those movements combined. And it started out at the very beginning as a popular spiritual movement that was trying to reinvigorate spiritual life in Eastern Europe at the time, which had become, certainly the spirituality had become pretty head-centered and not as embodied. And so the initial teacher of Hasidism, and for the first few generations, they were emphasizing things like embodied practice with the body. It was called avodah shebagashmiyut in Hebrew, which meant literally embodying the service, having physicality in one's practice, so that eating and enjoying food was a spiritual experience, that being happy was a good deed. And these are times when, instead of needing to learn all of the texts in order to have access to something like Lurianic meditations, you could hear a melody, or listen to a story, or go for a walk in the woods, or say prayers in a simple way. These were inroads towards a more experiential and ecstatic lifestyle that was also very much meant to be connected to groundedness in practice, and also in really connecting with the body. Things changed over time. Hasidism became more ascetic, more, I guess, self-denying of the body. Over time, it became more insular. But in the very beginnings, it was articulating a theology that God was here. God wasn't out in the cosmic realm. God wasn't beyond our world. God was right here, right now. And in that experience of God being everywhere, early Hasidism, they were asking questions. Well, if God is everywhere, and that means God is equally in every place, in every time, in every book, why is the Torah holier than another book? Why is this time of the week, Shabbat, holier than other times of week? And so you start getting Hasidic teachings about, well, there's some people who experience God at all times, and every day is like Shabbat for them. Or, yes, the Torah exists, and this is how God is incarnating in our world. But also, before the Torah was written down and given to us, God, as the ancient ancestors knew, God could be found everywhere. God, the Torah itself was written into reality in the trees and the rocks and the sun, and that every moment, every part of reality actually is like the Torah in that it invites us into wisdom and into connection. So that were some of the profound offerings of early Hasidism. And many of those influences have resurfaced in our world today. This is us. Here we are now. And some of the major features of the current mystical Jewish movements that's happening, which could be called really broadly neo-Hasidism, but I don't think that quite captures the essence of everything that's going on. There is a reinvigoration of Jewish mysticism and Jewish spirituality into Jewish life in every denomination. It's because of things being translated and teachers coming forward with information and also rediscovering things that might have been lost prior. The nature of Jewish mysticism is reemerging, and it's also evolving. So today, people have access who didn't have access before. So there is gender diversity in the access to Jewish mysticism today in a very unique and special way. There are also people who are actively teaching Jewish mysticism to anybody who has a willingness and a want to learn, not just within the Jewish community itself. And so there's actually new influences coming from within and from without. There are people who have explored psychedelics who are then reflecting on ancient texts. There are people who are studying different spiritual lineages from the East and from the West and rediscovering messages within our lineage that might not have been accessed before. It's really a time of great creativity and ingenuity as this latest era starts to emerge. And I am personally very excited about what's coming next. Sometimes people ask, where does this all lead? And they might mean Jewish mysticism, where is it heading? Or where does my path lead? If I'm an evolving, adapting human being, where does it all go? And I'd like to share the name of the, so to speak, final destination, or the foundation of reality in Kabbalah, which is Ein Sof. That means without end. There is no end to the evolution of what can be. It's a very exciting journey. And that also means that from the perspective of the never-ending journey, or from the infinite one, anybody is doing something of validity. Everything is equalized in that eye. It doesn't matter if someone's been doing this for 35 years, someone's been doing meditation or prayer or some kind of study for all this time. From the perspective of the infinite, we're all on an equally valid journey. And so I invite you to come along and take these steps with me into the unknown with curiosity and openness. There is no limit to what you can find. And thank you for joining this lecture for the first class of Intro to Jewish Mysticism.